Good evening. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, welcome to this book talk with Rita Mattia, author of Trying Stuff, a collection of recollections. I'm Tom Ankner, the director of the Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center at the Newark Public Library. Rita Mattia was born in New Jersey. Many of her ancestors lived in Newark, but Rita grew up in Lyndhurst and later lived in Denville. She now lives in Northern Virginia. Her book, she says, is not an autobiography or a memoir, but a collection of vignettes from her life. Many of these vignettes involve her formative years in New Jersey. Others have details of the lives of her ancestors. The book is funny and touching and personally revealing. Tonight, Rita will read excerpts from the book, make some comments, and then take questions. We ask that everyone leave their video and audio off during the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat box. We will get to as many as possible after Rita's presentation. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Rita Mattia. Rita?
Thank you so much, Tom. This is my book, and I'm holding it up because this is my mom, who was absolutely amazing. She was known as Teeny, and she appears in a lot of my stories. And this is a very little me, and we're sitting on our porch in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. The first thing I'm going to do here is tell you that, not that you care, I have a bad back, and from time to time, I'm gonna do that. And then I'll sit back down again. So don't panic when you see that happen. I'm going to begin by reading you a little bit from the introduction to my book. I think it gives you a sense of what kinds of things I like to write about, what kinds of things I like to share from my life. And I think this will kind of whet your appetite for the book too, if you should decide to acquire it. So these are highlights from the lengthy foreword and introduction to Trying Stuff. The life of one of my direct ancestors, a fourth great-grandfather on my father's side, is recorded to have been miraculously saved in the mid-1700s by a man who became a canonized saint in the Roman Catholic Church in 1903. It took a lot longer then to get your wings. If you're a Catholic from the Newark area or just a lover of Italian food, you've probably heard of Saint Gerardo of Maya, and you may even have been to his huge October feast organized by St. Lucy's Church. A far less fortunate ancestor, a maternal great-grandfather, was hit and killed by a Pennsylvania Railroad train on New Year's Eve in the late 1800s, leaving a penniless widow and their two toddlers literally out in the cold. Around that same time, another great-grandfather died in a jungle in Brazil, though what he was doing there does not necessarily fit with the rest of the story. And another great-grandfather, the artist Petrino Buonaparte Mattia, and I believe he's coming up on our screen now. He wrote a memoir as well, and he claimed in his memoir to have had dinner with Guglielmo Marconi and to have fought off a lion in a cage. And as if that were not enough, to close the 19th century, a great uncle owned a popular Newark saloon in front of which he staged a huge St. Rocco's Day celebration, including a fireworks display, that killed and maimed dozens. Oh. And of course, more stuff is happening as I decide which stories from my life and from my family's colorful history to share in my book. Right now, I'm going to share a few of those with you here on Zoom. And I'm back. This first story it's about a lot of things. There's a lot of themes, a lot of ways of thinking about family. But the star of this story is my grandma, Effie. If you know my family or you've ever heard me talk about my family, well, Effie was a legend. When she died at the age of 99, I couldn't believe that she was gone. I thought she would live forever. And because I can write about her, in a way, she will. So chapter 7 from my book is called Moonlight on the Water. Hiya, kiddo, Grandma Effie shouted as she headed toward my car in the train station parking lot. Referring to my dad, she asked, "What's the old grump's got planned for us today? Can we take a run on the back roads first?" She knew my name perfectly well, but it thrilled me to have this exotic woman affectionately call me Kiddo, the name I knew she reserved for me and me alone, the only child of her only child. Sort of. Grandma Effie was not my grandmother at all, but the second wife and childless live wire widow of my grandpa Angelo. Excuse me. In the 1960s, she formed the habit of inviting herself to my parents' lakefront home, often calling from the Denville train station just across town to announce her surprise arrival, or sometimes she'd be there for the weekend. Well, wearing a massive floppy hat tied beneath her chin, flashy costume jewelry, and her favorite espadrilles, 70-something Effie would descend from the aging, smoke-belching, Erie Lackawanna commuter train with its green and white striped canvas window shades and wicker seats. And there you see her in front of course, a saloon. She was invariably handed down to my waiting arms by one or more attentive and far younger men. These gents had just appeared en route from the decidedly rough neighborhood in Newark where she lived above a luncheonette with her friend, Freddie, 20 years her junior, who, by the way, was not allowed in our home by my very conservative father, and she would show up at our place in the country. Oh, lovely young men, she would say to me as she waved goodbye to her devoted new companions. Just lovely. For the urbane and effervescent Effie, the attraction of the sleepy northern New Jersey town of Denville was simple. Lakes, and lots of them, including Indian Lake, on which our house was located. Converted from a weekend place for New Yorkers to a year-round residence, the circa 1930 one-story bungalow boasted a large porch overlooking a grassy yard and about 100 feet of lakefront that included a small private dock. The house had just enough space to pack in my mom and dad and me, some beat-up furniture, and what few possessions of mine had made it to this house when the larger one I'd grown up in closer to New York City. When Effie visited, I slept on the couch. Dad had orchestrated this move from Lyndhurst, where I had spent my entire childhood, to Denville the fall I left for college, insisting it was what your mother wants. Perhaps, but my mother, Teeny, was now condemned to live out her life in a bed or a recliner, far from friends and family. A cruel disease had rendered her quadriplegic. As for me, hell, I didn't even know they'd moved till I began arrangements to come home for college for Thanksgiving that first year. Throwing away pretty much every personal item I'd left at home, my father said, if it had been so important to you, you'd have taken it with you to college. So I pretty much resented the place. But at the far opposite extreme, Maddie just loved life on Indian Lake. And there he is in his boat. Well, I'll tell you, from his dock, he could cast a line, and if he was lucky, pull in a smallmouth bass or sunny or pike that he would always toss back. Or he could yank hard on the cord a couple of times and be off and running around the lake and its small island in his 16-foot pale green fiberglass runabout with its shiny black Mercury outboard engine. And when people came to visit on weekends, he could wrap them in Mae West life jackets and haul them around in circles on his water skis. You know, come to think of it, perhaps it was what Mom wanted for him. It's hard to guess a half century later, with Effie, Teeny, and Maddie all gone. It's hard to guess who really wanted or needed what. The view from the porch included glorious sunrises, but what was really cool was when on clear nights, the lights of the houses on the hill across the lake joined the moonlight as it spilled across the water. A factory worker who toiled long and hard 5 days a week, Maddie was master of his waterfront paradise the other 2 days and every evening. Excuse me again. Effie's love affair with lakes may have begun in her native Pennsylvania, but like that of my dad, this passion was fueled by weekends at nearby Bud Lake, where in the 1930s and 40s, my grandparents and their hard-drinking friends, Grandpa Angelo died young, They and their friends would picnic all day and party all night at a small cabin that may have been owned by one of Grandpa Angelo's brothers. After they married in 1940, my parents often joined this raucous clan for Sunday cookouts at which watermelons, quart-sized bottles of beer, and tubs of potato salad stayed cool in a chilly mountain stream that fed the lake. Effie, who had ridden an Indian motorcycle in the 1920s, got that? Motorcycle, 1920s, and had an impressive scar on her forehead to prove she had once collided with a buckboard wagon on a country back road. Effie was also in love with my white 1965 Triumph Spitfire with its 2 red seats. So she insisted that every visit, after we bade a fond farewell to all the lovely young men, begin with a gravel-tossing ride, top down, no matter the time of year, on the semi-paved roads that twisted around the lakes. Some lakes were a few miles across and visible from the winding roads. Others required sneaking down private drives for a glimpse of glittering water, swimmers, boaters, skiers, and gracefully gliding Canada geese. On this particular summer afternoon, as I tossed her small case into the space behind the seats, Effie dared me to take my beloved white roadster, get ready, across the planks of the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad Bridge, above the waterfall that sent the overflow from Essling Lake cascading into Indian Lake below. But if sitting on his beloved porch, Maddie could have observed our plunge into the chilly water below. "We can make it," she laughed. "The train runs only every 2 hours on weekends." Well, I drove as far as the pull-off before the bridge. "Nothing doing," I finally said. "Dad's already mad at me for coming in late last night. A call from Denville's finest would ground me for months, if not longer." I didn't say what I was really thinking to the daredevil whom I worshipped, but would not quite follow anywhere. "And Grandma, I'm too young to die." "Then let's take this baby up to Hopatcong, kiddo," she shouted. Known locally as the Big Lake, scenic Lake Hopatcong was a half-hour west of Denville in the foothills of the Poconos. Grinning and not wanting to disappoint her twice in one day, I shifted into gear and we were off to explore 45 coastal miles of bars, restaurants, marinas, parks, and beaches. I'll tell you what, I quickly lost count of how many stops we made or how many more lovely young men had the pleasure of making her acquaintance. At the time, I was still under 21, the New Jersey drinking age, and was content to be her wheelman and to hear her throaty laugh. Hours later, as evening beckoned, we pulled up at the bungalow and headed inside. Carrying her brightly flowered bag, I followed Grandma Effie into the house at some distance. "Where have you two been?" my father barked. No greeting, no hug for Effie. Unsmiling, he glared at me. Effie winked at my mother, who failed to suppress a smile. Untying and removing her big hat at last and shaking loose her still red curls, Grandma Effie archly replied, "My train was delayed. Fortunately, I had the company of some very lovely young men to keep me occupied." Glancing approvingly at her own reflection in the living room mirror, she winked at me and said to my eye-rolling father, "Now, stop yapping, get me a drink. Let's go sit on the porch. I need to see a lake." The lights from across the lake winked back at her as we three stepped out onto the porch. No boats were out on the lake that evening, and we could hear crickets and frogs calling to one another across the water. From inside, I could faintly hear the music my mother was listening to. Frank Sinatra was singing just for her. Then I overheard Effie whisper to my dad as she wrapped her arm around her shoulder, "Thanks for inviting me, kiddo. I love it here." Hope you enjoyed that. Damn, I miss Effie. All righty. I have another story for you, also from my book, And I'll just throw out here that I have tons of other stories that I tell when I have a drink or a friend around or whatever. But this story, the second one I'm going to read tonight, is also from my book. People sometimes ask me how I know so much about my family history. Well, folks, I've spent hundreds of hours digging and researching, yet some of the most compelling and meaningful stories have just fallen into my lap, like this one, for which I have scads of photos and documents of support. And I will add, many of which are now at the Newark Public Library. But we'll come back to that. For now, I'm going to read Chapter 5, Finding Uncle Pete. My late father, known to friends and family as Matty, could be quite entertaining. In fact, the men in the factory where he worked for 38 years thought he was a riot, as did the guys in his New Jersey bowling league. He had a large repertoire of jokes and seemed to have one for just about every occasion. But he was a different man at home. Whoa, was he ever. Angry almost nonstop and verbally abusive to my mother, to me, and especially to my son, who disliked the man so much he didn't come home from college to attend his grandfather's funeral. But despite all that, I'd always tried to cut my dad some slack. His beautiful and loving mother, Carlotta, had died suddenly when Dad and his brother Pete were still in grade school. His father, Angelo, always more free spirit and self-proclaimed Renaissance man than doting parent, largely ignored the two boys, who were passed around in the family for the first couple of years after their mother's death. As to Giuseppina, Carlotta's mother, Matty and Pete's live-in grandma, she abandoned them all as well and died in an insane asylum 5 years after Carlotta. Yikes, what a family. So, Pete was 5 years older than Matty, graduating in January 1928 from the highly regarded Barringer High School in Newark, New Jersey. One of the many treasures I have, this is the 1928 graduating class from Barringer High School. And my Uncle Pete's in there, third row from front, seventh person from right. And there he is. So he graduated from that high school and went on to study at the University of Alabama. Following in his brother's footsteps, Matty attended Barringer for 1 year, but was then inexplicably compelled to move with Angelo and his new wife, Effie, to rural Pennsylvania, where they thought they might dabble in agriculture. Whoa. Matty had no sooner begun high school again than Angelo and the always lively Effie decided to move on. It was during the Great Depression, and they had, quite literally, lost the farm. Whoa. In the years to come, Angelo would fancy himself an inventor, formulating and selling a carpet and upholstery cleaner called Superfoam from a Newark storefront. He neglected to patent it, which didn't help with his success. I honestly don't know how the heck they supported themselves, though Effie was no stranger to work. After Angelo's death, in fact, Effie briefly converted that storefront to a lingerie shop before moving in with a man we knew only as Freddie, who owned a nearby luncheonette that she helped him operate. Anyway, meanwhile, Matty, still in his early teens, stayed behind in Pennsylvania, lived in a boarding house, and worked nights setting up pins in a bowling alley to support himself. He was determined to finish high school. Now, when my dad talked about growing up, he invariably turned to reverential tales of his older brother, Pete. Pete was extremely handsome. Pete was extraordinarily intelligent. Pete was studying medicine at the University of Alabama, which he attended on a football scholarship because Pete was also an outstanding athlete. According to Matty, if Angelo fancied himself a Renaissance man, it was Pete who actually embodied that ideal. But where on earth was this Uncle Pete? It was the question I never asked during these adoring peons, because whenever my father spoke of his brother, my mother shot me that look. When we were alone and I asked her about my elusive uncle's whereabouts, She said, as women of her generation often did, we don't talk about it. Whew. When my parents died, a few days apart, many years later, it fell to me to deal with their material things. In my father's dresser, I found, of course, that photograph you're looking at. I also found Pete's 1928 Barringer yearbook. He was, as reported, quite a handsome fellow, but he'd been in something called the social club, and that was about it. No sports, no academic honors, nada. Beneath the Barringer book was Mattie's 1934 Hanover, Pennsylvania high school yearbook. He was grinning, it seemed, from every page, a standout in sports, a comedian in the school play, a captain of the debate team, an editor of that yearbook. In fact, nearly everything my dad said Pete had done, Mattie himself had accomplished. And in that book, he looked happier than I'd ever known him to be. With little time to pore over objects, their lakefront home within commuting distance of Manhattan, soul like that, I rapidly tossed everything from old photos to bowling trophies into unmarked boxes to take home with me, threw away tons of debris, donated tons more, and returned to Richmond, Virginia, where I had lived for many years and had a business to run. Then, a year or two later, I was invited to visit my cousin Donna, who, while clearing out her parents' New Jersey home, had discovered boxes and boxes and boxes in the basement containing her grandmother's photo albums and scrapbooks. Now, Donna and I were great pals. This would be such fun. Sure enough, there were her parents and mine cavorting on a beach in 1938. Her mother in saddle shoes and a sweater set. Her grandfather, my grandpa Angelo's younger brother, writing about Benito Mussolini in glowing terms for the local paper. Whoa, this was living history. It was I who opened a scrapbook and found the first of several brittle 1933 newspaper clippings, including one with this headline: Youth slays mother of two, ends his life. That headline was actually kinder than the article. Pete and his married lover Alfreda were found dead of gunshot wounds, hers to the chest, his to the temple, in a room she had rented in Newark after leaving her husband and two young sons. Pete was described as a college dropout and factory worker. It was ruled a murder-suicide, and Pete was the alleged shooter. But as many other interviews and articles, including one in the New York Times, would reveal, 23-year-old Pete had never owned a gun, nor even handled one as far as anyone knew, and the antique pearl-handled weapon found at the scene was unfamiliar to everyone. A witness who'd been with the couple earlier in the day said they seemed happy and loving. They had met, apparently, after Alfreda and her husband and sons had moved from Scranton, Pennsylvania, into a Newark rooming house owned by Mattie and Pete's grandfather, Petrino, the artist. Family members, who mistakenly believed they were somewhat connected in the city, demanded further investigations. The police refused. The case was closed, leaving the family to wonder first and foremost, what about the spurned husband? Clearly, no one outside the family seemed to consider the possibility of Pete's innocence. After a week-long flurry of sometimes lurid press coverage, he was a violent Italian. The story, like my uncle, vanished. Ooh. Mattie was now more alone than ever. Had Pete ever told his little brother that he loved him or was proud of him? Was he even aware of the courageous young man who was trying so hard to measure up to what he imagined his older brother to be? Or was he too preoccupied with wooing another man's wife? Who had told Mattie what happened? And how had he reacted? This all occurred during his triumphant but solo high school years in Hanover, Pennsylvania. And who who was there to comfort him? Oof. As Donna and I sat there in that damp basement, there was no one left to ask these or any other questions. As far as we knew then, everyone who had ever known these people had passed on. Donna gave me the entire scrapbook. We divvied up the photos and spoke briefly of what we had learned in hushed tones. But what really was there to say? About 10 years later, after his own father passed away, my son decided it was time to learn more about his ancestors. Together and independently, we attacked the internet and before long had found sinners, saints, and surnames on my Italian side of the family that we could trace back nearly to the time of Da Vinci. We traced his late father's family back to a country that no longer exists. Anybody ever heard of Bukovina? I never had. To some 16th century Germans and to some stern-faced others who were apparently important enough to have had their portraits painted. It was exhilarating. We decided that my son's large home would be the repository for the rapidly accumulating vintage photos, documents, and online printouts. And so one weekend, I brought all that I had gathered to his place, including boxes I had not opened since clearing out my parents' house a decade earlier. As we dug through and attempted to organize the clippings and yearbooks, I could see Chris softening a bit toward the grandfather he'd never been able to love or understand. Here was a wounded soul who'd done his best and had simply come up short. In fact, after high school, Matty had returned to Newark, lived in yet another rooming house alone until he met my mother and began to work in the factory where he toiled away until his retirement almost 40 years later. In one box, we found 3 aging wool felt pennants, a dark blue one from Barringer High School, a dark red one with a tattered leather school seal from the University of Alabama, and a mysterious blue one from Abbottstown, Pennsylvania High School. And we found 2 yellowing high school diplomas with Matty's full name. He was actually Homer Theophilus Mattia. On them, one from Abbottstown, 1932, and another, Hanover, 1934. What the heck? 2 more high schools after Barringer? A day or 2 later, my son excitedly emailed me some newspaper clippings he had found online. One explained that in the 1930s, Abbottstown had been a 2-year high school. Those graduates who wished to complete their education had gone on to nearby Hanover High. More amazingly, how had he found these? Matty's name appeared in archived stories about debates won, track meets starred in, and speeches delivered at both graduations. Gradually, Chris began to enthuse about the grandfather who had silently, sadly, angrily held on to these mementos for almost 70 years. And perhaps, for the first time since his birth in 1914, Matty was being recognized for his accomplishments by proud family members. Not long after that, I created sepia tone enlargements of the 2 brothers' high school yearbook pictures. And I took those and the 3 colorful pennants to a professional framer who created a large collage enclosed in a 1930s molding. It hangs in a place of honor in my son's home, an affectionate tribute to 2 brothers who, like most of us, were just doing their best in difficult times. Together again, they looked back out at us, young, expectant, and seeking the love they thought they deserved. Thank you. I'm going to take a sip of water. And I'm going to do that stretch I promised. Here I go. Ta-da! All right, my head's out of frame. My head's in frame, and I'm zipping back up to my desk. I hope you're enjoying this so far, although I know that all of my stories aren't always happy ones. The next one really is. And this is also from my book. This one's kind of short and sweet. And I'm sorry to tell you, it doesn't include the photo you might be hoping for, though I do have what might be a surprise image. So here we go. Chapter 18, White Lightning. One Saturday during the year or so I lived with my parents after college, I borrowed my father's car to run a few personal errands. When I returned, I'd looked at several new cars for which my savings could cover the down payment and for which I believed I could handle the estimated monthly payment. I reasoned that if my father had known the nature of my mission, he would not only have insisted on accompanying me, he would have bullied me into allowing him to select the car as well. And I'd have wound up with the equivalent of his 1956 pink and charcoal gray Dodge Coronet with push-button drive instead of the white 1965 Triumph Spitfire convertible with a 4 on the floor that had captured my heart. "Oh, how much is it?" I asked the eager salesman. $23.50, he answered. "Would you like to take her out for a spin?" No, thank you. When I returned home empty-handed, my father accepted the car keys as I handed to him and said, "Where did you go?" Giddy with anticipation, I did not choose my next words wisely. "To buy a brand new English sports car." Oh, my mother laughed out loud. I had told her what I was up to in general, but had not told even her what sort of car I was planning to look at. My father shot her a look and whirled his head around to me again. "I hope you're kidding, young lady." Ha! Well, I stood my ground, saying nothing. "Those cars are notoriously dangerous. The electrical systems never work, and they are way overpriced. More importantly, they are not made in America, and we have to support American labor. You are not getting one." Again, I stood my ground, saying nothing. Did he really think the subject was closed? Excuse me. The following Saturday, I asked our next door neighbor, Russell, an easygoing beatnik artist, if he would drive me someplace. "Sure," he said, asking no questions. He dropped me off at the Telltale dealership, where I walked up to the salesman I talked to the previous week and pointed to the car. "I'll take her," I said. "You mean now?" "Oh, yeah, now." He helped me put the top down. No easy feat. A check was written, paperwork was signed, and an hour or so later, I pushed in the first clutch my foot had ever touched and felt the little car buck. Push-button drive had not prepared me for this. Although I'd never ridden a horse, the metaphor came easily. "Little girl," I said, "you and I are going to have a lot of fun riding together. Now you just settle down and let's get to know one another." I stalled her. I fluttered her. We hopped all over the back roads, bringing her home. But by the time we had traveled the 15 miles or so to my parents' home, we had enough of an understanding that I could pull into the driveway with some confidence and turn her off without stalling. And I had named my first car. She was White Lightning. Russell, his wife, and the kids must have been watching out the window for me, because they surrounded the car before I could even climb out of it. A moment later, my father came outside to see what was causing a commotion in his driveway. My hair was still an exuberant wild brown tangle, but my elation, that had begun to ebb. My father was not really to be trifled with. As I climbed out of the car, Russell immediately took my place behind the wheel, moved the seat back, and held out his hand for the keys. Then he reached across the car, opened the passenger side door, and patted the red leather seat next to him. "Come on, Matty," he said to my father. "Let's see what this baby will do." They were gone far longer than I would have liked. And when they returned, my father delivered a stern lecture on automobile care, safety, and so on. And I did my best to appear attentive and appreciative. We both knew something had changed between us. I had not purchased an automobile at all. I had put a down payment on my freedom. "Thanks, Dad," I said, all the while thinking, oh, thank you, Russell. Now, Tom's going to bring up an image here. A lot more happened that summer. For one thing, I became Russell's artist model. This large framed oil painting still hangs in my home more than a half century later. For another thing, it was that summer that I left New Jersey, for better or for worse. Thank you again.
That was great, Rita. Thank you very much. That was terrific.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
We do have a couple of questions for you, but now you have a couple of other things you wanted to say. Is that right?
Well, I have a couple of self-serving things I want to say before
Okay,
we
well,
take comments from our fans.
We love self-serving comments, so go right ahead.
One is that, and I think most everyone here knows it, but maybe not, I have a weekly podcast in which I tell even more stories of things I've tried or things that have tried me. It's called Rita Writes and Reads. And as you can see, it's tricky, and you can find Rita Writes and Reads wherever you find and enjoy podcasts. The other thing is something you mentioned, Tom, earlier, and that is that copies of Trying Stuff are still available from my publisher, though if you're an autograph hound, we may have to do it a roundabout way. Either way, I have an email address for this purpose that's pretty easy to remember, WRITA@mail.com. And it's also mentioned at the end of every podcast.
And I just typed it in the chat box, so if somebody wants to.
Great, fantastic. I really appreciate that. Tom, thank you so much for hosting this. I'm looking forward to questions, and I will also say that if we have time and if we feel like it, I can also read one of the stories from the podcast because they're not in the book. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
So we do have a couple of questions, so let's get to those. Okay, so John Fascino asked, what about your parents did you learn that you can see in yourself?
Ooh, well, I'm a tough, smart aleck like my mother. I'm also a kind of a free spirit sometimes like Effie, although she wasn't, there's no DNA there, but there sure was an influence. And as to my dad, you know what? I guess from my dad, I learned what not to do. When the going gets really, really, really rough, you really have to let go of the pain. And my dad never did. But I think that's something I've learned that you do need to do. Thank you for that question, John.
Sarah had a question. Rita, thank you for reading my favorite story from Trying Stuff, White Lightning. I just love this story. Question, have you continued to write stories since the publication of Trying Stuff?
And of course I have, and I read those on my podcast. And some of you who know me know that I have an amazing son, Chris, who has been helping me to assemble those. And we may be turning them into a print book. We may be turning them into an ebook. We may be turning them into, what's the other thing? I don't know, turning them into something. But we are collecting the stories as I read them. We're compiling them. And I'll tell you what, he's an engineer, but he's an amazing proofreader. So yes, many, many more stories are coming.
So there are a few other questions that I could ask too. Did you write this book because you got bored during the pandemic, or was there some other reason?
That's a good question. In one of my podcasts, I tell this story. I kind of always knew I'd be a writer, even though my life didn't seem to take me there for a long time. Then I wrote advertising for, oh golly, half a century. But I kept feeling like I was some other kind of a writer. And about 2 years ago, I was clearing out a storage locker and I found a box, and on the box it said, Rita Writes. And I opened it up, and in it were all these printouts of little essays and stories that I'd written over the years that I just kind of, I don't know why I printed it out. It's a good thing I did, because then I tossed them aside. They didn't seem important. And when I started reading them, it was the beginning of my book. And it was the pandemic, and I had nowhere to go. And so this became a book. In May, I guess we can call it May of the pandemic.
Okay, all right. So somebody else has asked about how about making it into an audiobook? Have you done that, or have you thought about doing that?
That's an interesting question. When you create an audiobook, the production is a lot more complicated than one might think. And it's not something I could actually do myself. And so, and it isn't something I could readily, what's the word I'm looking for, distribute myself either. So if I decide that there should be an audiobook, I think I'd want to narrate it myself. But I'd have to marry Amazon.
Yeah. It's a complicated thing. So tell us, somebody else wants you to tell about your followers all over the world.
Oh gosh, this is so much fun. This is really fun. And this of course has to do with the podcast more than the book that I'm here to talk about. This was so funny. I figured that my friends, I had emailed about 100 friends and said, woo, I have a podcast, ain't I something? And I figured my friends would listen in, but the podcast host sends me stats. And the stats are not very accurate, but they're really interesting. They tell me the cities from which my listeners hail. 16 different countries, including places just really out there like Moscow, Kuala Lumpur. Do you even know where that is? I have a fan in Kuala Lumpur. Yeah. Canada, Brazil. I'm big in Brazil. I have listeners in about 5 different cities in Brazil. And I have listeners in Australia who tune in all the time, and they're not my cousins. I have cousins in Australia who are over on that side of that monster country, and my listeners are over here. It's been really fun. It excites me very much to think that this happens. But it's funny how some of it happens. And this is, I think, a fun story to tell. When you create a podcast, you have to provide a description of what this episode is about. And in one instance, I tell a story about my first marriage to kind of a hippy-dippy guy. And we lived in a hippy-dippy neighborhood, and our friends indulged in things I'm not going to say here on the air. And one night we had a call from these frantic friends who believed that there was a boa constrictor in their living room. Well, maybe there was, and maybe there wasn't, but we went across the street to see what we could see. There was a boa constrictor in their living room. It had come up the drain pipe, the rain pipe outside, and in their open window. Well, when I described this story for the podcast, I got huge listenership from around the world, including somebody from Turkey. Why? Because they had entered the keyword boa constrictor in their Google search and come up with my podcast about the boa constrictor in somebody's living room. So wow. that was just really kind of a crazy story.
So this is another question from the chat box. It's Dee and Sarah. You mentioned your career in advertising. How do you think that has influenced your current writings?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I know exactly who Dee and Sarah are, and they are wonderful persons with whom I worked in advertising a while ago. And I'll tell you what it did do, and I'll tell you what it didn't do. It made it hard for me at the end of the day to turn around and write something I felt like writing, because I'd been writing all day. But the flip side of it was that I developed discipline as a writer. Whether I felt like writing or not, I had to write every darn day if I wanted to get paid. And that discipline really helped me when I finally stopped doing advertising and I could write for myself. I had already developed those good habits, and I could spell. There's one thing you don't.
That's good. Yeah.
That's one, and it's funny because when you work in an advertising agency, which some of you may have, some of you may never have, you have a lot of backup that you don't have when you're sitting by yourself in your studio writing stuff. You have people who are actually fact checking you. You have people who are spell checking. You have people who are proofreading you. People who are saying, that's pretty clumsy or whatever. But when you're by yourself, you have to do that for yourself. And what I learned to do after losing that support staff, what I learned to do all those things myself. And but at least I already knew they had to be done. I don't know if you've ever, this book was self-published, which is to say, I don't have a printing press, but I worked with a company that produces books for people like me. And where was I going with that? I just got lost. Is that because I'm 78? Whoa, Daddy. I don't know.
Me all the time.
I hope that never happens to any of you.
Yeah, I'm sure it happens to everybody. So I have another question. So you and your family have donated a lot of family photos and memorabilia to the Newark Public Library's archives and elsewhere related to these and other stories. Where did it all come from? Where did all that material come from?
Good question. Now, in one of my stories that I read this evening, I told you about boxes that we found in my cousin Donna's family's basement and things that I found in my parents' home. But the real avalanche began after a cousin I'd never known existed found me on Ancestry.com about, I don't know, maybe 12 years ago. And he said, I think we're cousins. And his great-grandfather and mine, Petrino the artist, were brothers. And each of them had had 8 children. Whoa. And each of them had gone forth and multiplied. And suddenly I realized I had hundreds of cousins, hundreds. And we began to connect. And I would tell these cousins, well, look, see, I have these pictures. Oh, I have these documents. Look what I have. Look what I have. Pretty soon they started to send me stuff. Sometimes they sent me physical stuff, which I'll roll back to in a second if I can remember. And sometimes they sent me scans of pictures, and sometimes they sent me photographs of things that they had. And the next thing I knew, I had become the family archivist. I have 2 huge glass-fronted bookcases that are just filled with these things. And yet, my cousin Karen and I delivered boxes of them to the library as well. The killer treasure came about, a short time before you and I met, Tom. My cousin Eddie gave me a box and I opened it, and in it, it still takes my breath away. And it was a cigar box. And in the cigar box were 20 glass plate negatives from the photography studio of those 2 men, those great-grandfathers who had been brothers. They'd had a photography studio in Newark. And here were these negatives, glass negatives, that dated from 1886 to 1915. A dazzling thing that just came my way. Eddie had found them in a building in, I believe it was Newark, where our family had 2 different printing companies in the 20th century. And one was called the Mattia Press and the other was called the Mattia Printing Company. And the latter was housed in a building that my cousin Eddie inherited, and he cleaned it out. And that's where he found this. Amazing. What if he hadn't cleaned it out? What if he hadn't found that box? But I knew they were really a treasure and that they didn't belong in a box in my house.
Okay, well, we appreciate your donation. Thank you very much.
It was exciting to meet you people too. Now, when is it? What time is it? Okay, I tell you what. Do you want me to ask you about your podcast? Sure. Ask me about my podcast.
Yes, so tell us more about your podcast. Is it stories from your book or new ones? And I think you've already touched on this already. Would you like to read us a short one of those?
I thought you'd never beg. This one's short and a fun way to kind of close this out. These events took place in my hometown of Lyndhurst, New Jersey. The year was probably 1955. It was one of those things I remembered one day and said to myself, oh, dang, I should have put this in the book. It's called Maternal Instincts, and it's spelled INSTINKS, instincts. Somewhere around my 12th birthday, my father told me to get a job. It would have no effect whatsoever on the chores I was expected to do around the house, but there would be no allowance going forward. I was now old enough to work outside the home. A bit of research revealed that if I were a boy, I could deliver newspapers, shovel snow in season, or mow grass, also in season. As a girl, I had one option, babysitting, but at least it was year-round. Almost immediately, it seemed, I had my first gig. A couple in the neighborhood was going out for a while, and I was to take care of their rather small infant for 3 hours for 25 cents an hour. If she cries, the young mother said on her way out, heat up a bottle on the stove and give it to her. They're in the fridge. I would estimate the time between the sound of their massive 1952 two-tone Buick Special lumbering out of the driveway and the ear-piercing screams of that baby to have been roughly 17 seconds. I boldly approached the Norge, removed a cold bottle of milk, placed it in a dry pan, and turned on the front burner of their gas-fired Magic Chef. As I did so, I briefly reflected on the fact that this would be the very first time I had ever used a stove for anything. The flames were immediately and somewhat alarmingly much higher than I expected. But I figured that would speed things up. And I was pleasantly surprised by how readily I could ignore the child's screaming as I wandered around the house looking for something to read after I'd fed the baby and things had settled down. This would be an easy 75 cents. The next time I cruised the kitchen, oh boy. The pan was filled with broken glass, scalded baby formula, and a rapidly melted, flaming rubber nipple. The smell was awful. I had fleetingly thought that might be the baby herself and wondered how you handle that. I really didn't know. Well, while the baby's howling escalated, I cleaned things up and debated whether to try again with the remaining bottle in the fridge. I chose instead to walk to the crib, calmly and reasonably explain to the hysterical baby what had gone awry. And then I settled down to read the current issue of Life magazine. After the Buick had eased back into the driveway, earlier than expected, prescient perhaps, and the couple had walked in to find their baby completely hysterical, I calmly and reasonably explained to them I had not minded keeping their child company while they were gone, but that I really could not possibly take their money as I'd inadvertently destroyed one of their baby bottles. Well, I left that couple staring at me wide-eyed, walked back home, and decided I was probably not cut out for babysitting, or in all probability, motherhood. But I was wrong about motherhood. Breastfeeding made that really easy. Thank you.
Just got to start my video. Yes, there you go. That was very nice. That was very nice. So will there be a second book? You kind of touched on this a little bit.
Well, you know, we're trying to figure that out. In all honesty, a paper book, such as Trying Stuff, a lot of work I may or may not decide to do. Ebook, just maybe as a PDF, or maybe it's just something that it's out there on the internet, and then even though you wish it would go away, it never does, because that's what happens to things on the internet.
Okay, so we've had some nice comments here. Thank you very much. So I'm going to just wrap it up now. Thank you, Rita. This has been fun. Remember,
Thank you.
remember, if you want to order Rita's book, email her at the email address I am going to put in the chat box right now, which I already have before, rita@mail.com. Rita as in WRITA @mail.com. So you email Rita at that address if you want to order her book. And thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, I'm Tom Ankner. Good night. Be safe, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tom. Good night.
Thank you, Rita. Good night.